the next three sections, I will pretty much provide a high-level overview of the environmental review process, and then cover a little bit of duplication of benefits and administrative planning and activity delivery costs. But first, I want to just start with the environmental review process. So the environmental review process is not just a box to check. It really does serve a critical purpose. First, it ensures that any CDBGDR project complies with federal environmental laws and regulations. And that just basically means it's protecting people, property, and natural resources from any potential harm. And then, second, the review is designed to evaluate and mitigate risks. So, before a project moves forward, for example, the review considers whether it might be located in a floodplain or near like a hazardous facility or in an area with endangered species. But finally, the environmental review is pretty much about safeguarding the community's long-term recovery by carefully assessing impacts before construction begins. We can reduce the chance of costly delays or disallowed costs or even, funding clawbacks later on. But, in short, the environmental review helps us, build a smarter, safer, more sustainable projects that, truly serve our disaster impacted communities. Now, when we talk about environmental review under CDBG-DR, there are um, several main levels of review, at least five main levels of review, and each of these are based on the potential impact of that particular activity. So, like the first level is exempt category, and this category just applies to activities that have no physical impact on the environment, like, administrative planning costs. Then you have the second level, which is categorically excluded, not subject to. These are activities that are technically excluded from further review because they have minimal or no effect on the environment, like certain public services or general management actions. And then the third level is categorically excluded subject to, which basically here the project is still minor, but it requires a review against specific federal laws and authorities. So, for example, rehab work that doesn't, expand a structure, but could affect things like historic preservation or floodplain management. And then the next level is the environmental assessment. This applies when the project has potential for significant impact, but that impact, isn't certain. So in this case, the review process documents whether a finding of no significant impact or FONSI can be issued or if the impacts are more substantial. And then the most extensive levels, that environmental impact statement. This is rarely needed, for projects, but it is required if a project clearly has significant impacts on the human or natural environment, such as a very large scale development. But the important point for applicants is that every activity must be reviewed and placed in one of these levels before proceeding. And that level determines the amount of documentation and the time it will take to get environmental review clearance. So when we talk about when an environmental review is triggered, the key factor is whether federal funds like CDBGDR are being used for an activity that could have impact on the environment. So the review is triggered before, any choice limiting, activities are taken. So this means that projects cannot move forward with contracts, demolition, construction, or site work until the environmental review is complete and approved. So even if the activities that may seem minor, like acquisition, rehabilitation, or site improvements, these things can still trigger a review because they involve physical changes or potential environmental impacts. So in other words, the environmental review is not optional. It's required. It is a required safeguard, especially whenever there's a potential for federal fundings to alter like your land or your buildings or resources. But it's also important to emphasize that environmental reviews apply to all tiers of funding, whether the funds are spent directly on the project or indirectly, through applicants. This ensures compliance with federal law and prevents HUD from later finding that violation that could put that funding at risk. So when we talk about environmental reviews, one of the most important concepts to keep in mind is choice limiting actions. So these are actions that a grantee, subrecipient, or even a partner could take, that could take before the environmental review is completed and approved that would effectively lock in a project decision. So, for example, acquiring property, signing a construction contract, starting demolition, or committing non-refundable funds before the review is finished. These are all examples of your choice limiting actions. And HUD is very, strict about this. So if any of these actions happen before the environmental review is complete, it is considered a violation of federal requirements, and the activity may have to stop or fund it with, non federal dollars. So the rule of thumb is that, when you're in doubt, just check with, the state or the responsible entity before you commit to any action that could be seen as a choice limiting step. So before environmental clearance, some actions are okay, like certain preliminary designs or feasibility studies or like a phase 1 site assessment, because they don't commit the project. But actions again like purchasing property or demolition, signing contracts or ordering materials, things like that, these lock in the project and violate the HUD rules. So bottom line, you can plan and study, but don't spend or build, until the clearance is complete. Now, let's talk about who prepares and signs off on the environmental review record. The responsible entity in this case is the state, and they're the one that will prepare the environmental review record and coordinate with agencies, and they'll make sure all laws and regulations, are followed. And they're ultimately the ones who would certify the review is complete before the project moves forward. And then, of course, HUD may have oversight, but the responsible entity holds the primary responsibility. So the preparation of the environmental review record starts with the defining of the project and documenting the site through things like photos and maps. And then the preparer would gather the data, consult with the state regulatory agencies, and complete all the necessary public notices, and then finally submit that request for release of funds, which must be approved before spending begins. Now, some of the when we think about what can slow down or even stop a project, there are some common triggers that come up again and again, and things like floodplains are major ones. If your project touches these areas, you almost always have extra review steps. Wetlands are another common trigger, as well as sites near endangered species habitats. And then, of course, historic properties. Each of these triggers, doesn't necessarily mean your project won't move forward, but it does mean added time and steps. So it's best when, these are identified early. Now, sometimes your project may have already had an environmental review completed, maybe under FEMA. So in those cases, HUD regulations allow for what's called, formal adoption of FEMA's review. This, can save time, but it isn't automatic. So the state will still have to verify that the FEMA's review meets HUD standards and covers all the required environmental laws and authorities. So, if a gap exists, the additional documentation or studies may be required before the state can approve the project. So, adoption is possible, but, it's always going to be needed to confirm, the compliance first. And just remember, so if any work started before federal funding was in place, that that project may be ineligible. But again, that's gonna have to go under thorough review. But HUD considers this a choice limiting action, and it can't be reversed. So um, always wait for the environmental review and official clearance before starting. And like I said, if in doubt, just pause and check with the state before moving forward. Just like I said, when in doubt, just, always bring your environmental review discussions in early, especially when you got multiple funding sources that are involved, and because that, will help you save time and, avoid any other delays later. And just remember that, you can reach out to the state or any of your TA partners, before you commit to contracts or construction. Just a quick conversation up front can prevent, your project from becoming ineligible. So let's walk through this exercise 6. And this scenario is pretty much about obtaining site control, um, and what it means and what's required. And remember, site control is a key piece, for HUD compliance, because it shows, that you actually have rights to the property before moving forward with federal funding. And so in this scenario, the town of Riverbend submitted its CDBGDR application 2 months ago. The plan is to use CDBGDR funds to purchase privately owned land and develop a multifamily housing complex on the site. But currently, the town is waiting for the state to approve the application. The environmental review has not yet been cleared, but however, the town council wants to move forward with obtaining site control. Anyway, so can the town move forward with site control now? A, yes, by purchasing the land immediately. B, yes, if the purchase contract is signed with the contingency clause for ER and funding approval. Or C, yes, but only through an option to purchase agreement clearly contingent on ER clearance and state approval. Or D, no, the town must wait until the ER is fully complete before any action. And so really, the answer is, pretty straightforward here. C, an option to purchase agreement is allowable under 24 CFR 5822 if properly conditioned. So, HUD recognizes different forms of site control, such as ownership, lease agreement, and an option to purchase. So, in this case, the option to purchase is allowable, but the important point is that you must be able to document that you have that legal ability to carry out that project at that site. So, I know without site control in place, your project probably can't move forward in your in the process. But just make sure that um, your option to purchase agreement has all the contingencies included in order to obtain that site control. So now let's move to exercise 7, which focuses on how FEMA's environmental reviews may be used to support CDBG-DR projects. So in this case, the city of Riverbend began repairing its damaged water treatment plant using FEMA public assistance funds immediately after the disaster. A FEMA environmental review and FONSI were completed as part of that process. The city now needs additional funds, CDBG-DR funds, to finish the project. So, however, they also started site clearing before submitting their CDBG-DR application. Uh, they asked, can we use the FEMA environmental review so we don't have to start all over? And what about the clearing? Can we keep going? So, which of the following is correct given HUD's guidance? A, yes, if the FEMA review covers the same scope, the state RE can adopt it for CDBG-DR, even if site clearing has already begun. Or B, yes, the city can continue site clearing since environmental review is already done by FEMA. Or C, no, to use the FEMA review, the scope must match and the state RE must formally adopt it. Clearing before CDBG-DR clearance is a choice limiting action and makes the project ineligible. Or D, no, FEMA environmental reviews are never accepted for CDBG-DR projects under any circumstance. And so, many of you may already know that FEMA, conducts the environmental reviews for their projects. So, if your answer is C, no, to use the FEMA review, the scope must match, and the state RE must adopt it. Clearing before CDBG-DR clearance is a choice limiting action and makes the project ineligible, then you are correct. So again, HUD does allow adopting FEMA environmental reviews, in many situations. And but the bottom line is, before starting any work, just still, make sure that you check with the state, and don't, begin work like clearing or purchasing property until, the state RE completes the environmental review and clears that project. But, let the state examine those documents and adopt that FEMA's review. Now, in this next section, we'll go ahead and talk briefly about the duplication of benefits. At a high level, the state will pretty much conduct the duplication of benefits analysis. So you as applicants won't be responsible for completing the calculation yourselves, but, it's just helpful, to understand what the state is looking for and why. So essentially, HUD requires that federal funds not duplicate assistance already received from other sources, such as FEMA, insurance or SBA loans. That means CDBG-DR can only cover unmet needs that remain after all other assistance is accounted for. So while you won't be doing the full analysis, you should be aware of how it works and what documentation the state may review. And so here are some of the common sources the state checks for duplication of benefits, including, any FEMA assistance or just any other federal, state, funds. But the main idea is to just ensure that applicants are not paid twice for the same damage or unmet need. And just remember that it's not about, denying funding. It's pretty much just about making sure that the resources are coordinated and, used appropriately so that limited disaster recovery funds, can stretch, as far as possible. Now, the state carefully reviews duplication of benefits before awarding the CDBG-DR funds. So they'll look at what assistance has already been provided, and then they'll compare that to the documented unmet need, and then calculate what, if any, CDBG-DR funds can be awarded And this process ensures that no one is compensated again for that same cost and that federal dollars are used only where there's still a gap that exists. And this is just an example of how, a simplified way of how duplication benefits calculation, works. So say like your total project cost is 500,000, and you already received 300,000 from other sources, and that left you with unmet need of 200,000. So CDBGDR funds can only cover that gap, that unmet need, not the costs already covered by other funding. And so this ensures that that the federal dollars are only, filling that true gap. And so while the state is responsible for conducting the actual duplication of benefits analysis, applicants, still play an important role. And that role is to make sure that, you disclose all sources of disaster assistance that you receive. And again, whether that's FEMA or um, other, any other funding. You'll also need to keep records, provide documentation, respond to any state requests for clarification. Basically, essentially, just think of your job as being the first line of defense, making sure the information you submit is accurate and complete so the state, can run their analysis without delays. So the cleaner your records are up front, the smoother the state's review will be, and the faster your projects, can move forward. And some of the, I want to highlight some of the few common pitfalls that applicants run into. And first, sometimes, projects are rushed forward, without fully completing, your duplication of benefit checks. So that can lead to serious delays or ineligible costs. Another common issue is incomplete documentation, especially, if it's not in writing. Um, he'll consider that not verified. And finally, sometimes applicants forget to coordinate across funding resources sources, so that can cause a duplication or miss opportunities. But just keeping these pitfalls in mind, hopefully it'll save yourself a lot of time and frustration, down the road. And so before we wrap up this section, let's highlight a few key takeaways. So first, the state will complete the duplication of benefits analysis, but it's still important that you understand, what they're looking for. And then second, keep documentation from the start. This makes the review process much smoother. And then third, just, avoid those common pitfalls that I mentioned earlier, by coordinating funding sources early, checking with the state before committing to projects, and just, think about compliance. And just remember that, the strong record keeping and clear communication with the state are your, best tools for success. So let's walk through this exercise on duplication of benefits. And just remember that, again, duplication of benefits, happens when multiple funding sources are used to pay for the same eligible cost. So in this exercise, a town applies for CDBG-DR funds to repair a sewer pump station damaged by Hurricane Helene. FEMA Public Assistance has already approved 400,000 for the same repair. The total repair cost is estimated at 650,000 though. And then the town has not yet spent the FEMA funds. So based on the DOB rules, what is the maximum CDBGDR amount the state could approve for this project? Is it A, 650,000 because CDBGDR can fund the full project? B, 400,000, the same amount FEMA approved? C, 250,000 unmet need after subtracting FEMA funds, or zero, CDBGDR can't be used for infrastructure repairs if FEMA funds are available. And I'm sure you all guessed the right answer, which is C, the unmet need. After you take into account all the projects funding sources. So we're now going to discuss our last section for this training, and that is administrative planning and activity delivery costs. Yay! Almost there. So, why these costs matter? So, these costs matter because they affect how much funding is available for actual recovery work. So, administrative planning costs um, keep the program running and compliant, while activity delivery costs make sure individual projects can move forward. So, understanding the differences between these help you, budget correctly and avoid charging expenses, to the wrong category. Now, planning costs are pretty much the upfront investments, we make to guide recovery projects. So these include things like your studies, surveys, or designs that shape how funds are spent, and they pretty much ensure projects align with the community needs. They don't, build homes or do any type of physical activity, but they do set the foundation for successful projects and compliance with HUD requirements. So, in short, just, planning costs, just make sure we're, doing the right projects in the right way and just, spending our uh, major dollars. Administrative costs are those general management and oversight expenses that keep the program running, but are not tied to one specific project. These include things like staff salaries for program administrators, office supplies, record keeping, reporting, and, monitoring. But HUD caps administrative costs at a certain percentage of the grant. So, these funds need to be carefully tracked and justified. And the key is that these costs cover compliance and accountability at the program level, not direct delivery of services. So just think of administrative costs as the back office expenses. Now, project delivery costs are tied directly to um, getting the funded project carried out. So these are not general admin costs, but expenses that can go towards like inspections or engineering design or construction oversight that make it that are necessary to make the project happen. So, for example, in housing, it could be inspections, doing paying for inspections and title searches, and like for infrastructure, it could be engineering or bid preparation. And for economic revitalization, it might, include marketing or site remediation tied to a project. But this slide, identifies the key differences and, pretty much pulls everything together by showing those differences, between the three cost categories. So, like planning costs, it's about the big picture preparation, like studies or community-wide strategies, again, not tied to a specific project. Your administrative costs focus on program management, compliance, record keeping, again, not tied to one project, but necessary for the overall program. And then your project delivery costs are always tied directly to a funded project, things like your inspections, engineering, relocation expenses. But the main takeaway here is that the cost, if the cost is tied to a specific project, it's project delivery. If it's broader, it may fall under planning or administration. And then again, just, going over some of the common, pitfalls or mistakes, just like the other topics that I covered in this presentation. I just want to highlight some of those that, pretty much can slow your projects down or cause ineligible costs. First, we often see applicants try to charge general overhead or admin expenses to a project, but those may may need to be covered under, program administration, not project delivery. And then sometimes project delivery costs get charged without being clearly tied to an eligible funded project. So just, remember if the project doesn't go forward, those costs cannot be, shifted to CDBGDR. And finally, a common mistake is double charging. So, for example, staff time or consultant costs being billed under both admin and project delivery. HUD expects a clear distinction. So if you um, so you'll want to document how each of these costs, is assigned. So avoiding these pitfalls, will make your reimbursement much smoother and, pretty much keep you in compliance. So the key takeaways, if you remember one thing, that is, administrative cost ensures accountability, planning ensures eligibility, and project delivery, of course, ensures delivery. So, but together they, keep the project moving and compliant. Now let's go over our last exercise, and that is understanding project activity delivery costs. In this exercise, a local government is applying for CDBGDR funds under the Community Infrastructure Program to replace a damaged water main. So as part of the project budget, they include one, engineering design fees for the water main replacement. They also include time spent by the town's project manager overseeing contractor work, travel expenses for the town manager to attend a disaster recovery conference in another state, an environmental review, field inspection, and mapping costs. So, which of the above costs can be classified as eligible activity or project delivery costs for the project? Is it A, um, items 1, 2, and 4, or B, just 1 and 4, engineering design fees or environmental review inspections, or C, all of the items, or D, only the engineering design fees? So the correct answer is A, items 1, 2, and 4. So engineering design fees, your local staff time, all are tied to the project, and your environmental review work, are allowable. Again, they're all tied to that specific project. Travel for unrelated conferences is not. Okay, so, I understand that this has been a lot of information to take in within just a couple hours. But we don't want you to, feel overwhelmed. Just remember that, you're not expected to navigate all these processes, alone. There are multiple partnering agencies here to support you, whether that's the state or school of government or your COGS or associations, like the Association of County Commissioners or the League of Municipalities. Just remember that, each of these organizations, they do have staff that's dedicated to answering your questions, which we have listed here, and help you, just navigate through, these HUD requirements and just, help you move your project forward. So as you leave today, just, please take away this, that you have a network of technical assistance partners that's ready to assist you. Don't hesitate to reach out early, before any potential issues or challenges arise. And just remember that, collaboration is key. And like I said, these agencies exist to ensure that your application is successful and in using these recovery funds